Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Liesbeth Unger. I will be the moderator of this webinar, Ask the Expert session. Before we start diving into the topic of corporate sustainability due diligence legislation, I will first introduce the speakers of this webinar and a bit about the structure. So as I said, my name is Liesbeth Unger. I'm the founder of Human Rights at Work and a human rights and business advisor for the past 12 years and learnings partner in the Netherlands. And with me, I have here my colleague, Marcus Leuning. He is the former Human Rights Commissioner of Germany and the founder of Leuning Human Rights and Responsible Business. And together we host Dylan McNeil, who is the Global Director for Supplier Sustainability and Human Rights at Royal Philips. So we're very happy to host together this Ask the Expert webinar. This learning has been doing this already several times, and the structure is that we will first give you introduce the topic, set the scene for the coming 20 minutes. And then we really want to be an interactive webinar. So we invite you to raise your questions already in the chats while we are speaking. You can also already upvote questions if there are questions that you think are most interesting to get answered. And of course, after the 20 minutes, you could also raise your hand and then we will unmute you to raise your question live. So that is a bit the structure. And then, well, we hope for a very interactive session. But first, let's set the scene with Marcus. Could you introduce us to the European scene of the coming due diligence legislation, sustainability due diligence legislation that are expected?
Thank you very much, Liesbeth, and hi, Dylan. Good morning, everyone, or well, it's not. Well, I'll stick to good morning, everyone. Very happy to do this, and great to see that it's so interesting for so many of you. So what I would like to do is just give you a very, very brief overview of the situation in Europe as a whole to then start the discussion. So if you have specific questions about some of the legislations I'll be addressing, please just ask the question in the chat or in the Q&A. So what we can see if looking at this map of Europe is that there's a whole lot of different kinds of legislation regarding mandatory human rights due diligence in place. Sometimes it's more reporting structure, as we've seen in the UK with the Modern Slavery Act. Sometimes you have legislation, as in Switzerland, which is specifically focusing on minerals and on child labor. Then you have laws which are also, the Netherlands have a law in place that looks at child labor. Lisbeth is going to talk more about that and explain more about that in a minute. You have a Norwegian law which is looking at transparency as well. And then you've got laws outside of Europe, like in the US, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which has a very specific characteristic. So this multitude of legislation makes life difficult for businesses because they have to comply with these different deep requirements of the law, while at the core, there's always a standardized human rights due diligence process. Usually, if you follow the OECD guidance for responsible business, for example, you will be able to meet the requirements, all of these laws, with arrangements around the reporting and so on, and adjusting on some details. But the core process is always the OECD process or the UN Guiding Principles process. Still, I believe it's very good that the EU took the initiative to align and to make sure that for the whole single market, for the whole European market, there will be a complete set of legislations which will cover all of these human rights due diligence requirements. And as you can see on the next slide, it is not just one law, it is a whole set of laws. So there's a regulation on conflict minerals, which is very specific. But there are laws which are covering a broad range of industries. On one side, the financial industry, which I think is really important because they are a major actor regarding corporate social responsibility as a whole, or sustainability as a whole, and specifically also regarding human rights. So there's the disclosure regulation for financial institution. There's a taxonomy regulation which tells people what is a sustainable investment. Then there's now coming up is the new EU non-financial reporting directive. It just has been reformed. This addresses the industry where you have to report under a common European framework regarding your sustainability activities. That is adopted but not enforced yet, while the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is the one thing everybody talks about and everybody gets really excited about, that is still in the political process. The European Commission has submitted a draft. Now the European governments have decided on their perspective, their point of view regarding this draft, and European Parliament is in the middle of debating their view on this draft, and we'll see a political process of negotiations probably in the second half of this year, and then we'll see when they are through. There are some bits that are fought very hard because they're very controversial. But all in all, what's important for companies is that there will be one set of rules. They will be complex, but they will be manageable. And there will be what we will see is that this will probably be standard setting. So from our experience working with companies in Asia, for example, we see that companies start aligning on this upcoming EU regulation, which is good news for companies because that means, their counterparts in sourcing countries do actually know the regulation and start aligning with them for business reasons. So I think it's important that this now finally moves ahead. It will be good for business in the long run, and certainly it will also be good for the implementation of sustainability and for improving working conditions in supply chains. I would stay here at the moment, Lisbeth, and not go any further.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. That is really good to know what is happening at the European level. But we also have already some practice in national countries where there is already legislation, and Germany is one of them. I understand the 1st of January, the law will really enter into force, but already companies in Germany are, of course, preparing for this law. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it looks like and what companies are doing to prepare for this law?
Yes, so companies are preparing for this law, and the law basically has two elements. What you see on this slide is the process element of the law. So it does make requirements to companies regarding their human rights due diligence processes. What does the management system have to look like? What does it need to contain? And basically that follows the OECD guidance. It says there needs to be a clear responsibility. They call it a human rights officer, but they also say, any department of a company that has a potential impact on human rights should be included in the governance structure. There must be a statement by the leadership describing the processes. I think that's very important because it will send a signal to client, but it will also send a clear signal inside the organization. This is where we're heading as a company, and it will help also departments, for instance, say, okay, we want to comply with our policy statement as the leadership wants us to do, but this also means we need resources, for example. So I think the policy statement has a very important, there's a legal requirement, but beyond that, there's also an organizational requirement to that. And then the key of it all is, or the core of it all, obviously, is the risk management, the core risk management, which is always basically the same. It means you need to know your risks, identify your risks. There are some provisions about substantiated knowledge, and these are things I usually say, please do ignore them. Go for a good risk analysis. Know your risks. Only if you know them, you can manage them. And that's the other part, obviously, of the core risk management, is that you have systems in place that will trigger preventive measures where needed, but that will also trigger remedial action where needed. All of that needs to be a complete management system. It's not something where you can say, well, we'll do when it comes up. You need to have a structured decision-making system, for example. You need to have a structured system of who to involve in decisions. When do I need to talk to the legal department? When do I need to talk to the leadership? When is it good enough to talk to the sustainability department? So these things need to be clear before there is a crisis, because when there's a crisis, it will be difficult. And then the third part that the German law requires is documentation. Everything you need you need document and reporting, which obviously is one of the key elements of any due diligence, is that you should be transparent about what you're doing internally, but also externally. At the end of the day, again, it reflects the international standards of the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidance. And if you set up a system following this law, you will also be able to meet the requirements of the European laws. As far as we can see, there needs to be some adaptations regarding the reporting and this and that and the risks you need to look at, but the basic system will be the same. So my advice usually is, start building this, because you'll have to do it, whether you legally in the scope of the law yet or only next year or the year after. It helps making your business future fit. But Lisbeth, this is the German approach. What's the Dutch approach? We discussed it this week, and I was a bit surprised to hear that there is a law, but it's not enacted. And now there are new draft laws in Parliament, and also the government is working on something. So what's the Dutch situation actually?
Yeah, I think in the Netherlands, we were really surprised in 2019 already that Parliament agreed to a Dutch Child Labour Due Diligence Act. Nobody had really expected that it would really happen. But at the same time, the discussion started already ongoing that, why child labor only? Shouldn't we have a wider due diligence act? And most parties in the Netherlands agree with that, but thought that the political landscape would not be ready for a wider due diligence act. But that is changing also because at the EU, things are changing. Other countries like Germany are already taking leadership in this area. So in March 2021, there was a proposal in the and Sustainable International Business Conduct, but the Dutch government always maintained the position that they wanted to wait for the EU legislation to have a level playing field. But as this is a very long process at the EU level, as you already explained, Marcus, in December 2021, the Dutch government announced, and a new government that started beginning of this year, they announced that there will be Dutch legislation next to the EU legislation and probably also before the EU legislation. And in November this year, so actually last month, there was an adapted proposal from this first proposal from last year, which adapted already a bit to the EU proposal that is already there, but also to the position of the Dutch government. But it is still a proposal of the parliament. It's 6 parties which don't have a majority in the parliament. So it will be a proposal that needs to be negotiated still between the coalition and other parties. But I thought it would still be worthwhile to share with you some of the key elements that we are looking at, although it's still very uncertain if this will happen. And one interesting element is the general duty of care that is being proposed, which would be for all enterprises, big or small, when they do international trade, which many companies do because they buy something. They buy something coming from other countries. And these companies, they will just have a duty of care that they have to know or reasonably assume that there are negative consequences. And in that case, they have to take measures to prevent and mitigate and remediate them. But there will not be any administrative requirements nor a proactive monitoring. Only when there are reasoned objections that this company is not doing taking their responsibility, that can be taken to court. But the main body of this, and we don't know if this general duty of care will be accepted by a majority in Parliament. But the main body, and that is, I think that is quite certain that will happen, is a due diligence obligation for larger companies. And of course, that is a big discussion also at the European level. What is the size of the companies? Well, this is the scope that is proposed now, which is in line also with the non-financial reporting directive. And also the Dutch government looks like they're positive towards this scope, but it's still uncertain if this will be the scope. But what is certain is that there will be these 6 steps that look like the steps that are also in the German law, but the scope now is a bit wider because it's for all operations and business relationships, including the whole production chain. So not limited to the first tier, but of course also this will still be under negotiation. And the way it will be monitored is also still uncertain, but the proposal is that it will be administrative, criminal, and civil enforcement. So yeah, there is still a lot of uncertainties, but at the same time also a lot of similarities, I think, to the EU legislation and the German legislation, the 6 due diligence steps of the EU, of the UNGP and the OECD guidelines. So if there are already any questions about the German situation or the Dutch situation, please raise your questions in the chat. Dylan, would you like to explain a bit more what the situation is in Philips, how you are preparing, what steps you are already taking for preparing for this legislation?
Yes, very happy to. Thank you for that. And so Philips has done due diligence actually for quite some years already. We've tried to stay ahead of all these upcoming regulations, and what I'm going to explain are hopefully some learnings that you can apply when you start for yourself. I cannot stress enough and repeat enough, I think, the 2 frameworks that were already mentioned, OECD guidance and UN guiding principles. They have definitely formed the basis for the approach that Philips has taken. And you see the main pillars of that here in front of you. And so the key word is to develop a risk-based approach and to maybe not focus so much on all the small intricacies and the differences between the different countries that are now coming with regulations, but simply start to understand where are the biggest human rights risks in your supply chain and how can you then effectively address those. And if I start with the left pillar supplier sustainability compliance. What has really helped us is whenever we start working with a company, very early in the relationship, we will have a discussion on what we expect from them in terms of human rights behaviors. We will come to an agreement that when needed, we are allowed to assess how they are actually performing against the behaviors that we had agreed on, and that they also have an obligation to also look at their own supply chain. And especially for a company like Philips, that has a very long and complex supply chain, multi-tier, where not all the risks are at first tier, but a lot of regulations are going to expect us to also take some form of ownership further down the chain. This is really key, because if you all of a sudden already have a relationship and start to bring on all these extra obligations for that company to carry out on your behalf, it's going to probably be a bit of a different relationship over time, because the expectations are simply growing. And so it's very good to have that upfront conversation just to make sure also, is that party willing to support this, or are they already pushing back? And if they are heavily pushing back, yeah, you can ask yourself, why is that? Why do they not see their obligation or the responsibility for it? Or why do they expect this to be an issue going forward? If I then focus on the Supplier Sustainability Performance Program, that is really the program that we engage with our first-tier suppliers to try to understand what is now the current situation, how does their performance relate to what we had agreed on in the contract, and are there things that we can help that supplier with. In the past, Philips really relied on third-party assessors to audit our suppliers. What we, however, found is that this is not always an effective mechanism to understand risks, especially because, one, those third-party assessors will not really know your supplier as well as you do. They will not understand the inherent risks of the activities that that supplier might be performing on your behalf. And two, the focus is not really on remedy. It is on bringing risks to the surface, but then leaving it to the company to fix it themselves. Whereas you can ask yourself, if the company was really in a position to fix everything themselves, then why did the risks come to surface through that audit? And so what we do is we have an integrated in-house team that does both the assessment as well as works on remedy through sharing good practices with our suppliers. And we see that that actually leads, one, to a much more healthy relationship with our suppliers, because we're not the police officers, we're more the doctors that help them remediate any issue that they might be facing. And two, that simply shows back in the results in terms of the reoccurrence of some of the issues that we might find. The last pillar, responsible sourcing, is a very important one when it comes to tech manufacturing. I mentioned already, we have a very long and complex supply chain. And what we saw is that there are really high risks of human rights violations much deeper down in our supply chain, to the point that for a company like Philips, it's actually very difficult to have direct engagement. And so what the industry has done as a response is they looked at a certain pinch point in that long supply chain with a relatively low number of players, but who play a key role in then engaging that area of the supply chain where the highest risks are, and make sure that they all have sound management systems in place that they can certify themselves against. And then knowing that that specific point in the supply chain is certified against a certain standard will give them the needed comfort that they are taking ownership and responsibility for the risks that are deeper down in that supply chain. And I think that's going to be a very important element as well for future implementation of, for instance, the EU regulations to keep it manageable for especially then those long chains where you are expected to take ownership for the full scope of it. And this was just a brief introduction, but I really welcome any questions that you might have from a practitioner's perspective. Back to you, Lisbeth.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah, I think this shows that indeed there are possibilities also to manage your complex supply chains. And that's, yeah, there of course is a lot of discussion about the possibilities of that. We have come to the end of our input for this session. So we open the floor for questions. You can either do that by chat or by raising your hand, and then we will unmute you. In the meantime, while you're thinking of questions that you might have for either of us, I would have a question also for Marcus, how that works in Germany for small and medium enterprises. There has been a lot of discussion on whether this law should also be applicable for smaller companies. Do they already feel the consequences? Are they asked by bigger companies also to fulfill these obligations?
I think that's a very good question, because I think there are two big flaws basically in the German law. One flaw is that it's not clear about the risk-based approach. Somehow in the political process, it says, yes, only if you have substantiated knowledge or things like that. I always tell my clients, I say, you need to know what your risks are. So have a good look, take a good look at your risks. So that's one topic. And the other topic where there's a flaw is the question of big or small companies. Again, it is not about the size of your company. There are legal provisions in there, but they are, I think at the end of the day, they're meaningless. Because if you're part of a supply chain with business partners, they will anyway ask you because they need to report. And they're not interested whether you have 5,500 or 50 employees. They will want to know your risk, especially, and that again comes back to the risk-based approach, if you're in a risk-based industry. To give you an example, if you're producing, let's say, tables with wood from Poland, and you can have 500 or 800 people, this is not, a high exposure to risks. But if you are a commodity trader, and even if you're only 25 people, you may be sitting in Amsterdam, but you're trading high-risk commodities. You are a high-risk business, and you need to look into your risks. And also your clients will want that. So I believe it's important that companies take a step back from a purely legal view and look at it under a human rights risk view. And that is the lens that will help them also know whether they need to, set up a due diligence or whether they can be a bit more relaxed about that.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I also see here a question that is maybe also related. If there is already guidance, maybe in Germany, on how many tiers down the value chain we need to conduct due diligence.
I very much like what Dylan was saying about this. The human rights due diligence process is a process of permanent improvement, if you want to call it that way. So you start somewhere and you know very little. Some companies don't even know their direct suppliers. Sometimes they just know agents, and they don't even know the assembly level of their supply chain. So that's where they start. And then they go deeper and deeper in the course of the years. And there are tools out there that help them. There are contractual relations, as Dylan was describing. There are different ways of knowing more about your supply chain. And the German law doesn't require a company to know a specific number of tiers. It just basically says you must look at where you have the highest risks, and you must make an effort which is proportionate to your size and influence. So companies are left to take a decision. How important is that for us? What is the influence we really have? And are we serious about the commitment we're making? So I very much like this approach because it means the leadership of the company must go into a reflection process. What can we actually do? And at the end of the day, will we be able to tell a judge we did everything that was in our means and in our power?
Is that also going in Philips, Dylan? How do you make that choice where to focus on in the supply chain, which tier?
Yeah, so we have made a full analysis at some point of some of our products to understand what are now the different activities that then the different tiers actually undertake, and do we see inherently related to those activities an increased risk? And then it sometimes depends on the geography where those activities are occurring, or simply some of the dynamics of those activities. Towards the point of conflict minerals, in part that was driven by regulations, that we wanted to make sure that the metals and minerals in our products, the proceeds of that are not being used to fund armed conflict. But since then, that has quite evolved to focus on a lot more possible human rights violations. And it has then really been an industry initiative from all products that include electronics, to try to address this through a certification scheme. What's important to know about that certification scheme is that the results of that assessment are always fully known to everybody participating in that certification activity, and are then also expected actually to engage if there are still issues that do not align then with the policy that the company has set out and the expectations that they have set towards their suppliers. So I saw that there was one question related to how do you do that and how inclusive is it? It doesn't stop just with the certification that you then think everything is perfect. There is still an expectation to dive a little bit deeper than that. Philips itself is also part of several multi-stakeholder initiatives that then focus on trying to address the situation on the ground. So beyond actually the tier that has the certificate, to make sure that they are also continuously improving.
And there's also a question, Dylan, on how you increase the transparency in your supply chain. You do that with these multi-stakeholder initiatives?
In part, I think also what has been very important is when we moved away from auditing, when you are auditing, there is an inherent disbalance in power. You've agreed on a set of norms that the supplier is expected to uphold, and they are going to validate if they're following the letter of the law, let's say. And what we found is that that is not a very positive and engaging incentive mechanism. It's more or less the stick. And so what we have done since is focus a lot more on the carrot, emphasize the importance of transparency, and also actually reward suppliers when they are transparent to us, because then we will effectively start to help them to become better in a cost-effective way. And we think that there is a strong business case behind everything that we are engaging them on. And we really emphasize that even if the situation is not perfect now, let's at least get it out in the open, because then we can work together on resolving it. And that has really helped increase the transparency.
Yeah, so moving beyond the audit approach.
I think that, if I may, Lisbeth, I think this remark Dylan made about the business case, that's key, is really key. If you want to get your suppliers to seriously engage in that, they need to have a business case in that. If you just tell them, do this, do that, and it just produces costs, but has no benefit for them as a business, it's at the end of the day, it's not going to really work and last. So putting yourselves in the shoe of what is the business case for my supplier is so important.
Yeah, and maybe also related to that is a question, what are other trigger points when you engage with suppliers about their sustainability performance? So of course, in the start, you have these requirements, but other trigger points?
Yeah, so there's the pre-phase indeed, before you then go into a contract, but once the contract is in place, there's of course effective management of that. That is then also when continued dialogue takes place, depending on how much risk we see at one of our suppliers. It might be an annual engagement dedicated to human rights or more broadly sustainability, or if a supplier is already at a certain level of maturity, it could be every other year or sometimes only once every 3 years. But that is typically when they have a lot already in place and are quite effective in managing themselves.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going back to the beginning of the questions to see what remains. Yeah, maybe Marcus, you can answer this question about the main differences between the EU level regulation and the German one.
Well, obviously the EU due diligence directive is still under debate, so we don't really know what the end product is going to be. But you can see a few differences. So one is there's a lot of legislation for the financial sector, and that makes a big difference. We hear a lot of companies saying we have a private equity investor that wants us to do, to be in line with human diligence requirements. We hear from clients saying, my bank just called me or they sent a questionnaire and this is what they want to know. So that has a real impact, the whole financial regulation. And also behind that is, of course, the market demanding sustainable investments. So there's a connection there also with market demand. So finance is a big difference. Then probably, although it's debated, there's going to be a responsibility for downstream. So what does your product do? Does it potentially have a negative impact? It is part of the EU Commission's draft proposal. Let's see whether it will stay in there. There are more rights. So the German law explicitly addresses 11 different rights, and the EU draft addresses also some other rights. That's, if you have a due diligence system in place, you can add those, you can work with that. But there's one important difference, which I think really will make a big difference for companies. The EU draft at the moment requires companies to have a strategy at the directors level. And this is really important because what I see happening in Germany now is that companies start working on sort of all sorts of building sites. So do something here, do something there. Only a few companies are really taking a comprehensive, systematic approach, but that's needed. You need to have a systematic approach, really taking into account all the different activities, rolling out a risk management system, which is working on the same principles in all departments, in all business departments. And also it will help if the company has an overall strategy saying, how do we want to address human rights for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? What are the tasks we see? What are the challenges we see? Where do we need to invest in the development of methodology, for example? So it's all very new, and knowledge and instruments need to be developed. And I think it's important that the company board really looks at that in this strategic way. And that is something the EU law will require.
Yeah, and there's also a question about the role of the financial sector, which is excluded at the EU level. Is that, I know at least in the Dutch proposal, it's not excluded. How is that in Germany?
Well, it's people debate it. It is excluded. The EU government said we do not want it to be part in the scope of the Human Rights Due Diligence Directive. That's the position of the governments. Parliament will have a different view on that. The EU Commission has a different view on that. So I would, not get too heated up about this question. Let's wait. What will be in the final act? And there is a lot of let's say, market incentive and regulation for the financial sector regarding reporting with the taxonomy and so on. So it's not that there are no obligations for the financial sectors, they're just enshrined in other laws. But I think it would be good to include them, to be clear about that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I see also that's maybe a very different question about grievance mechanisms. I think that is directed to Philips. What grievance mechanisms have you implemented?
Yeah, first of all, we have lines open for any external stakeholder to report complaints, and then depending on the complaint, we try to follow up and try to remediate. And then, yeah, it's not really a one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately, because it's then really dependent on what the concern is. But so generally, if we would find any type of issue in terms of labor conditions, we will work with the supplier to make sure that it is resolved. And that remediation is then offered to the impacted employees at a supplier. I saw also a question on what are the expectations that you have towards your tier 1 suppliers in terms of their performance of remediation. I think there's a very important distinction between who gets to choose the suppliers that our suppliers are working with. There are situations where we tell a first-tier supplier exactly who their second-tier suppliers have to be. And in that situation, logically, we also have a very strong obligation to make sure that those tier 2 suppliers then are meeting our expectations. If they are fully free to choose their suppliers, then automatically they also have an obligation, in our view, to be quite critical and prudent on who they decide to work with. How do we support that? Generally, when we engage our tier 1 suppliers, we will also invite the procurement professionals from that tier 1 supplier to join in on our assessment to learn from our methodology. And so a big part of our development program that we have around our engagement is to get them up to a level that they are effective and then also working with their own suppliers. And so it kind of trickles down that we try to empower them, if you will, to set something up. And it is part of, as I mentioned, the first contract that we go into, and there is an expectation there.
Okay, thank you very much. Philips' example shows that there is a lot possible further down the supply chain. There are also a lot of questions for Philips. We will not be able to answer them all before the end of this session, which is 1 more minute. But we will try to answer the remaining questions by email. So I think, Dylan, you will help us do that for the part that is directed at you. There's one last question that I want to take, which is if there are any practical and standardized resources, tools from international frameworks for supplier risk assessments, supplier questionnaires, buyer trainings. Maybe, Marcus, you can answer that because Learning has a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, and we have some of these tools as well. So what happened is that as it is a new topic, not everybody is as experienced as Dylan and Philips. You know, you've been doing it for a long time now. For a lot of companies, it's fairly new. And so knowledge is developing at the moment. And that also goes for tools and technology. I think the approach that's important to take is that you need to have a decision to behave responsible as a company. You need to have a systematic approach to this. And then if you start rolling out the human rights due diligence management systems, there will be points or parts of that system that can be covered by tools, like standardized SAQs, for example, for suppliers, like risk assessment for countries, like sector risks that you can involve. And there are quite a lot of data providers and supporting agencies out there that can cover parts of that. But I'm not aware of anyone that really covers the whole management system. So most of that is under development. I know a lot of people working on that, and we're partnering with some software companies working on these kind of management system, but it's still under development. But
you see that a lot of
if your boss asks, you know, is there a tool that can do the job? Tell him, no, sorry, we need to make an effort ourselves.
Yeah. But you see that a lot of it is under development, and also the
Yes.
coming legislation triggers to have more and more tools available.
Yeah.
We come to the end of this session. I want to be mindful of the time. There's still a lot to discuss, a lot of questions remaining. Thank you very much for your active participation. We will get back to you. We will also share the link of this webinar so that you can maybe share it with colleagues or listen back. And there will be next Ask the Expert sessions in the next year. We already know on capacity building and supplier assessments, which may also be interesting to some of you. And if you want to kept up to date on these sessions, please subscribe to the Learning newsletter, and the link is already shared in the chat. So then I want to conclude this seminar and wishing you already a very good festive season that is coming at the end of the year, and hope to see you in a next Ask the Expert session. Thank you all, and thank you, Dylan and Marcus.
Thank you, Lisbeth. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice afternoon.